bien alors, bonjour à toutes et à tous. Merci.
Hello, everybody. Thank you, Francis, for this first roundtable and for passing on the mic to us. As you mentioned, here we have two representatives of Harvard University with us, so suddenly we have the feeling that we have a lot of great minds here with us, people who are very knowledgeable. Of course, it's an American company, but here on the stage, we have Ron Witte with us, who is American, born in California, who registered in Texas, Massachusetts, in several places. I'll get back to you, but also Joan Busquets. Joan Busquets works at Harvard, professor at Harvard University, but he's from Catalonia, and an architect and urban planner from Barcelona who did a lot in Europe. So let me introduce them, although it's not so useful, but Joan Busquets, you were at the heart of urban planning in Barcelona after Franco's rule, and it's a time when the city changed greatly. And that position, in those years, you were a pioneer in terms of planning for the Olympic Games in 1992 in Barcelona, and given what is going to happen in Paris, it's quite interesting to have your point of view on that and to know whether the question of mobility and transportation was as central at that time as it is now. Then you worked on many urban master plans in Toledo, Palma de Mallorca, in different places. You also worked greatly in Toulouse, in the south of France, and you had been appointed by a left-wing party and renewed in your position by a right-wing party, which is a sign of excellence. And for years now, you have taught at the School of Design at Harvard University. And next to you, Ron Witte, you're American. You are also a professor at Harvard University. You created your own architect company, WW, with the dean of Harvard Graduate School of Design. You wrote many papers, you participated to many exhibitions throughout the world, in different museums, and you also chose this year to work with your students on the station of La Courneuve of the Grand Paris project. So before dwelling in the discussion, I think you've both prepared some sort of PowerPoint presentation. I don't know who's supposed to be speaking first. Let's see who's the first PowerPoint. Maybe Ron Witte. I'll give you the floor then.
Thank you for your introduction, Philippe. It's really a pleasure to be here. I want to, don't worry about this title. I'm an architect, not a historian, so that history is going to take about 15 seconds. I want to try to introduce basically three subjects. A little bit why we may have given the Green Prize, and I think it's really a pleasure to be here with Joan because he was the center of that process. Then I want to talk about the studio that Philippe referred to, where I was teaching a subject related to the metro project, the expansion of the metro project, using the La Courneuve station as a site with a group of students. And then finally, I'll talk very quickly about a project that we did in our office, which is also related to the idea of mobility. Okay. So I want to start with a kind of diagram for a series of histories in Paris. And the reason for this being interesting for me is the fact that the metro has a very elegant way, I think the new metro expansion has a very elegant way of essentially overlaying these histories so as to not so much produce a new version of Paris, but basically to overlap all those versions, all of those histories at one time. This was one of several provocations for me when we were evaluating projects for the Green Prize. And it was certainly what was underneath my decision to teach a group of students, or to work with a group of students on the La Courneuve site. So here, a few projects. Again, I'm not going to try to explain these in depth. I just want to get a few images and a few ideas on the table so that we can start a conversation. But here are a few projects from that group of students. Maybe we can come back to that subject, Parisian Knees. That was the title of the studio. But this is one project now. One of the things that this student was looking at, one issue, was basically what happens as you create a surface in the city, and on top of that surface there's something which is basically local, meaning this is La Courneuve, and something below that surface which is of the entire city of Paris. So at every moment in this new system of 68 stations, there basically is a kind of double life which includes the entire city and whatever might be happening in the immediate district. That means very interesting things, I think, when it comes to architecture. Maybe that's important to underscore. I look at this subject not as an urban designer, but I look at it as an architect looking into the city or at the city, which for me is not necessarily an attempt to distinguish myself from an urban designer, but to simply declare the lens through which I take on the subject. That is the lens of an architect looking at the city. So for example, in this case, there's a kind of public zone, the sloping surface on the outside, adjacent to a program zone, something that Ellen, for example, was referring to in her presentation as always being important. Without the program, there is no possibility for formulating public life. This is a different project now, a student who was very interested in what the French typically refer to as équipement, but in this case, a kind of athletic center or health center. She immediately picked up on the Paris Plage, the boats in the Seine, there were swimming facilities, and observed very rapidly that there was no such thing in the banlieue in the same way that they exist in the center of the city, whether it's a pool or other kinds of facilities. So for her, the interesting piece of this project was to locate that kind of équipement directly on top of the station, which is immediately, of course, a quite serious architectural problem having to do with how you structure a set of swimming pools, very heavy objects up in space on top of something like a station. This is another project now, a student who was quite interested in the fact that if you continue further north from La Courneuve, you get into agricultural areas and a certain kind of history of life, but also contemporary life that was potentially very interesting on this site. And he became interested in the relationship between certain kinds of agrarian activities, in this case, sheep farming and the kinds of things that came along with sheep farming, and how those would relate to a potentially quite intense urban area. And I think one last project, which was done by a student who took, in some sense, a more traditional approach to architecture and its relationship to the city, meaning certain kinds of alignments with buildings and certain ways in which those alignments could be related to streets in various ways, and wanted to pull those alignments inside a building so that she could produce a kind of organization of program and movement inside a building that would form its own context relative to the immediate context, but nonetheless be sitting on top of this point, which was basically accessible to 1.5 million trips per day in the city of Paris as a whole. Same project. The last set of images that I want to show is a project that we did in our office about 1.5 years, 2 years ago. Curiously also related to Taiwan and related to what Philippe Ram was describing as a site that had been an airport. When that airport was moved, closed down, the airport was in the process of being relocated just to the north of Taichung. So this is in exactly the same city that Philippe was working in. And it is a project for an 840 hectare site immediately adjacent to what had been a military airport and is now in the process of being converted to a commercial airport. So the issue that I think is maybe relevant here, again, I'm going to avoid details as has been the tendency in these presentations. The issue that was really important here for us in the context that we're in here today has to do with this conduit of circulation and a spine that led on one side out into a new development and on the other to an airport. So one of the interesting things about this airport is it is within about 5 or 6 hours of 1/3 of the world's population. So from this site, whatever might be happening along this line is taking the possibility of access to that portion of the world and connecting it to the site here. Here's that spine, here's the airport. There's also a natural preserve along a hillside that's descending down on this side. So that spine has a series of access points running this way that you can see, basically animating the ground plane and determining to some extent how the land use plan or program would be developed. That's where I'm going to end. Thank you.
Joan Busquets.
No, thank you. Merci pour l'invitation. Je voudrais surtout
I would mostly
parler de
like to
quelques
talk
réflexions qui nous ont
about a
animés
few
sur la raison
ideas
pour laquelle
or the reasons why
jury
in our
Green Prize
jury for the Green
nous avons
Prize
choisi
we
le Grand Paris Express.
decided to select the Grand Paris Express. The jury was composed by Kerry Hildegrand,
Paysagiste,
a landscaper, Yves Blau, historian,
beaucoup de matière urbaine et dans l'histoire de Vienne. Et
who knows a lot about the Vienna history, and also Maurice Cox,
le directeur d'aménagement de
who was
Chicago
the
et aussi
head
avant de Detroit.
of Chicago and Detroit.
C'est un jury avec une composition assez riche.
So, very varied profile in that jury, people dealing with architecture, landscapes, and myself as urban designer. There were about 100 projects that we reviewed throughout the world, and we chose that project. There were many interesting projects, and the first conclusion, the first finding was that there are many interesting projects being implemented throughout the world. Not so many in Africa, but many interesting things to look at. And so I'd like to focus now not just on the rationale, but about the observations and questions on urban mobility. And so this is what we published with the team of Grandparent Express project. It's a publication that explains and gives a few reasons of this project. The observation is that there are changes in mobility patterns that are very strong, and the shape of cities will change, and we need to have the vision of sustainable vision and an alternative vision. We cannot continue with this type of model that we talked about even in the previous roundtable. This is Photoshop, of course, a Photoshop picture, but what we could say is that that's the paradigm in the 70s, 80s, but still today, it's still there, still exists, and this is today's architecture. So we can understand that the people making this presentation, they think it works quite well for cars. Otherwise, you wouldn't present that kind of images. And today, we should make things differently. As Marc Barani said, we need to change what we do and things shouldn't be set in stone. So there's a revolution in the mobility system. Mobility has changed a lot. Biking was very present until the 1940s, then it changed with the tram and the metro, and in particular with the first commercial lines, the airlines. What is important is that there is a revolution in the mobility system. And so this is a work that was done by Dominique Rougat. This is great work. This is called the Hub project. And what it says is that the different mobility patterns in cities, there are about 30 of them. And that's amazing. The discussions that we had in the past it was about, are you in favor of mass transit or cars? And today we see that there are 30 ways to move around the city, and Uber is not even here. So today it's about working with 34 different ways to move around the city and how to create public space with clear choices, including evolving mobility patterns. And maybe in 50 years from now, mobility will look very different. But when we talk about mobility, as we said before, there's a very important element, and that's the image that goes with it. It's commercial airlines. There are about 10,000 planes flying now. The whole population of Paris is flying right now. So it just gives us an idea. We are in the system is out of control. But at the same time, you can see here in Europe, in China, and in Japan, high-speed trains are being developed, and this is a major change. And people understand now that there is an alternative to airlines. That's the assumption that we had, and thinking that maybe in the northeast coast, if you have high-speed trains, such as the ones that you can find in France or in Spain, people won't fly as much. But today, most people in the US fly or drive, and that creates chaotic situations. In California and in other states, there are some changes. There are some major changes. And this is an important subject that we should take into account. But when we talk about sustainable cities, we talk about decarbonization of the world, and we need to change the way we move. We know that there will be changes in terms of how much carbon is emitted with planes, but we still need to change the way we travel. As you can see on the left here, it's Europe geographically speaking, and on the right, when high-speed trains will be implemented throughout Europe. There is a very efficient project between Lisbon and Porto with high-speed train, also in Spain and in the rest of Europe. So you can see that distances are decreasing with high-speed trains. So the conclusion is less of this and more of high-speed trains. But the question of urban mobility now. Maybe the Grand Paris Express is a project that will link the two scales. When we talk about megalopolis, we can find this system, the analog system. So it's the system of thinking a project at the scale of a city, comparing Paris, Berlin, and other cities. And at that time, it was about having a vision of the future of cities with this kind of image. And today we're no longer using this system, but the Grand Paris Express touches upon this question, and we'll talk about that later. But today, it's not just an analog system, it's a very complex system. And I come from Barcelona, so this is the map of Barcelona with the great infrastructure and networks of the city. That's the image that people know and have in mind when thinking about Barcelona. That's the old city. But today, that's how the city works. And today we need to understand the city by taking into account the different uses and day, night, morning, evening, and how things change at different times of the day. And we can find a lot of data today, and where we can, thanks to which we can make a difference between the different uses of the city. We need to take into account the fact that in city projects, fourth element, and now it's no more observation, but it's about the questions. You see here the maps of London and Paris. There are two major capital cities in Europe. There is great competition between the two cities. But there are also new types of mobility with the express metro, express mass transit. In Paris, on the right, you can see that the shape is very different to that of London. This is London, east to west, with the Elizabeth line, with the same objective, the same goal. It's about connecting areas that are very far from one another. You can see here very different pictures. And today, I think it's important to understand why we have a straight line or why we have multiple circles, such as in Paris. So, now, Paris, there were always some sort of systems going to the center of Paris. With Châtelet-Léal, Châtelet-Léal station is the metro station that has most passengers going through every day. And so with this project, it no longer goes to the heart of the city. They're connecting a lot of different towns and cities, and this will have a great impact. And within the jury, we always thought about the impact of this operation in Paris. It's difficult to predict, but the project is about preparing the future. A project can never assert certainties. It's about working with systems, and that's why it's interesting. And that's why this symposium is interesting, because it's about discussing, trying to understand what's happening in other cities. We're going to do this way in Paris because we've studied what other cities do, Berlin, London, Rome. Another question, what will the impact be? If we start comparing here, Grand Paris Express and San Francisco, you can see here in San Francisco, it's more or less on the same scale here.
c'est aujourd'hui, et je pense que tous nous sommes d'accord, c'est
Silicon Valley is
plus dynamique
the most dynamic area business-wise in the world.
organisé à notre image toujours
And
par la
this
voiture.
space was organized
Parce qu'il y a les BART. Les BART, c'est cette grande ossature,
with
cette épine.
having in mind
Vous
cars.
le voyez là,
And you can see
dans
here
les côtés
this
de l'épée,
spine.
que le Silicon Valley fonctionne. Et le rapport entre les trois aéroports, tout ça.
And so there are 3 airports, and
Attention,
everything is
les
connected.
BART, il était présenté par l'urbaniste plus important de l'Angleterre.
This project was proposed by Peter Holt
Comme un des great planning disasters.
as one of the great planning disasters.
Ça, c'est un livre de la 82. Entre les autres planning disasters, il était
There were other planning disasters,
l'Opéra de Sydney.
the Sydney Opera House,
Des
for
grands
instance.
projets. Parce que
There were
dans ce
great
moment-là, dans les années 80,
big
il
projects,
était moment contre les grands projets.
and he was against the big projects
Je pense, je reviens sur ces questions. Il faut
in the
faire
80s.
attention
So now we have to be careful
les idées que nous ayons et
with
l'idéologie des idées.
the
Parce que je
ideas
pense
and
que
the
c'est-
ideology. That's
Aujourd'hui,
another
on regarde,
important
si vous
question.
voyez à droite,
Here you
Silicon
see
Valley, à gauche,
on the right the
c'est
Silicon
Paris.
Valley, and on the left,
Paris-Saclay,
you
le
know,
plateau de Saclay.
Paris-Saclay
Aujourd'hui, c'est
area.
l'espace dehors la ville, difficile
It's outside the city.
à y arriver.
It's difficult
Ici,
to
vous voyez,
reach
Silicon Valley,
that area. And
c'est
if you have a
l'espace
look
qui est
at the
à droite,
Silicon Valley, on the right,
Frank Gehry, les Meta,
a
mais
project
ici,
by
vous
Frank
avez
Gehry,
Google, vous avez
Meta,
toutes
we
les
hit
grandes
Google and other major big tech companies,
vie, all
and also
tous ces
Airbnb.
éléments sont-
All these major companies are
Quand nous regardons,
headquartered
Grand
there.
Paris,
And
vous
when
voyez
we
que
look
le
at the
Grand
Great
Paris,
Paris project and the
avec
Greater Paris
trois
area,
gares,
there are
Paris-Saclay, le plateau de Saclay.
3
C'est difficile
train
d'imaginer, vous
stations
vous
in
l'imaginez,
Paris-Saclay.
mais va être difficile d'imaginer comment le
It will
plateau
be
de Saclay,
difficult to
il va bouger.
imagine
Ça, c'est le plateau de Saclay aujourd'hui comme un espace
how things will evolve
intéressant,
there. That's an interesting
hors la
space
ville.
here, but it's outside the city.
Et aujourd'hui, c'est un espace
And
qui est en
today,
processus de transformation incroyable.
it's undergoing
Avec le
major
projet de
transformation
Michel Devigne, ils
with
sont
the
en train
project
de
by
faire,
Michel
vous voyez
Devigne.
qu'il y a une opération où, on peut dire, l'opération, il compte beaucoup, pas sur la voiture, il compte beaucoup avec d'autres
It's not
moyens
about
de
cars,
mobilité,
it's also
et
about
avec une importance
integrating
sur le
other
paysage et le système naturel.
mobilities
L'hypothèse
and
d'imaginer
also
que la
working on
nature
the
et la ville
environment,
pourra devenir
with the
réellement
assumption that nature and
Ici, vous
urban
avez,
areas
par
will
exemple,
be
Paris
better
Express,
connected.
mais, comme
So the Grand Paris
préparé, mais
Express
il n'est pas encore là, mais qu'est-ce qu'il va
is
passer quand
underway.
il soit là, disons.
It's
Je
not
pense que
completed, but
c'est
what will
difficile.
happen
Le seul
at
système
the
qu'on peut
end,
avoir pour imaginer quel pourra être l'impact quand
what will be the
les projets
impact
sont.
once the
Dernière
projects are
réflexion,
finalized?
c'est le rapport avec les aéroports.
Finally, the relationship
était
with
toujours un élément qui
airports.
était off la ville,
Airports
hein, parce
were
que
always
c'était
outside
dangereux,
cities
de bruit, il y avait
because
tous
it's
les-
noisy, because of many
l'aéroport
different
aujourd'hui, avec le
elements.
TGV,
But
il devient un
now,
élément
with
assez
high-speed
dynamique dans notre
trains,
système
airports
urbain et le rapport entre.
have become more integrated into the city.
Aujourd'hui, à côté des
Now,
aéroports,
what
des
if
espaces de
next
TGV,
to airports
il y a
and
un
high-speed
système de
trains,
constructif complètement différent. Où il y a le
what
contraste
if
entre
we thought of these places as totally different? You have some sort of generic
d'induction
system
produit
on
dans
the
les espaces
left
avec les aéroports
and
et la haute vitesse.
another more dynamic system on the
À partir de
right.
ça,
And
il
from
faut
that,
nous permettre de penser qu'ils sont des espaces à
we
notre
can
vie, dans
think
notre réflexion,
that
comme hypothèse de recherche.
these
Ils sont des espaces
spaces
où probablement la centralité métropolitaine il va être développée. Mais il y a encore
will
une
become
autre couche qui est
city
développée
centers,
ici, mais
will
si
develop.
il n'y a pas seulement cet élément jaune, mais cet élément jaune, il devient une autre ligne.
So let's imagine
avec
here
notre
the
couleur,
yellow line,
le Grand Paris Express,
such
dans
as the
le
Great
territoire.
Paris Express,
Oui,
becomes
dans votre projet,
a new
projet,
city.
je pense que là, pour notre vie, c'est un sujet assez intéressant.
And
parce
so
que
this project
il
is
nous
quite
permet de
interesting
penser que
because
la ville du futur, il a une
the
capacité
city of the future
qui est projetée, même à cette échelle, parce qu'on dit toujours on disait il y a quelques ans, oubliez la mégapole,
will not be
il a
about
pas
a
changé de
megalopolis.
projet. Là, c'est impossible. Combien de maires il y a autour de
How many mayors are
Plusieurs
there
centaines.
around Paris in the different cities and towns? About 100 or more than 100. How are we going to create a project with more than 100 mayors? And that's what you did. So it's interesting to think about infrastructure projects for the future that are, well, they are top-down because that's how we do things, but every station, every area is a subject of discussions by all the towns and cities that it goes through. And I think that was another project that was interesting in your project. What will be the impact in the future? Difficult to tell. That's why the city is an interesting subject. It leaves many open questions. And our main concern is research by design. So it means that the project must cover different scales, but that in every scale it's a question of shape and project, geography, nature. And from that, we can think of a system of projects to create a sustainable city. That will be my conclusion. Thank you.
Joan Busquets, évidemment, c'est passionnant parce que.
Thank you so much, Joan Busquets. Yes, definitely. Warm round of applause. These are not answers, but rather questions and hypotheses. There are many of those, but perhaps I'd like to ask one to you, sir. When we see what's happening in Paris and around Paris, one ponders with regards to the possibility of such a project in the U.S. I mean, it seems that in the U.S., if you don't have any car, well, there's not much you can do at all. Same applies to the rest of France, actually, apart from Paris. If you don't have a car, not much you can do. But in the U.S., is there any place where you could imagine a project akin to that of the Grand Paris Express?
No.
That's enough.
I mean, almost truthfully and without humor of any sort, I would say no. But I mean, I also would confess that with a lot of envy was part of my view onto the Green Prize selection process was envy, meaning I think this kind of project is extraordinarily important, and the way in which it came to be remarkably quickly, not very many years to do something of this scope. I think it's extremely difficult to do in the U.S. today, if possible at all. Something like the BART project, for example, that Joan was talking about, is almost unimaginable to me today. And whatever Peter Hall said, it is the lifeblood of the entire region there. It would be it's a quite interesting comparison to make with Paris, but in terms of the logistics of getting something like this done, extremely difficult. And city after city or region after region has tried. There's a high-speed rail proposed in California, which is encountering so many difficulties. It's been in the works for many more years than this project, and is probably doomed. Houston is trying to do some things. Los Angeles is trying to do some things. It's extremely difficult. I would say impossible. And that has to do with a number of factors. I think the way in which one understands a city as a civilization. Also the way that governance works. This is a huge problem, I think, in the U.S. Look, I don't mean to paint, I'm an American at the end of the day, don't get me wrong. But so I don't mean to paint such a bleak picture of the U.S., but the system of governance is entirely different. And there are benefits in the system that France has that enable this project to be carried out. Centralization, in large part. Although I would also qualify that with what we saw during the jury process, which was centralization in the form of what happens in Paris is sort of affects the nation, and at the same time a hum of activity at each one of those 68 stations, which was fed back into the decision making in a really, really, I think, elegant, remarkably efficient for something like that, remarkably efficient way. And this is something that's quite difficult to compose in the U.S.
Right, so you were referring to centralization, yes, which is all the time presented in France as something that's really, really harmful, actually, as a bit of an open wound, a bit of a scourge. But at the same time, it's definitely proved to be an advantage on many other levels. Now, there are indeed 34 different mobility ways, very complex. So how can we address in a very simple way all of this? We cannot provide any complex answers either, right? Well, I do not have any direct answer to this. However, I believe that this is at the core of city projects. You know, Haussmann was very well known for his approach. He was working with an entire team, and he was really in a capacity to onboard all of these different elements. He had a huge team of key architects and engineers. And let us not forget about that. He was surrounded by an entire team of people. And from there, they built the concept of streets, avenues, squares. And however, the streets of our century, perhaps they're a little different from the streets back then, and yet we're still using the very same model when it comes to designing streets. You know, scooters, for example, they're all over the place, e-scooters, all over Paris, and they have completely shuffled things around. And in the next 10 years, I would imagine that there will be new mobility modes that emerge. Now, streets will remain a key part of cities, but when it comes to that centrality aspect of cities, we need to reimagine things in terms of shadows. How can you bring shadows to the city? And another question that's really important in your initiative is the following. You know, the idea that we do not just have an impact on those key elements in cities. Yes, you have airports. Yes, you have the Saclay area. But there are other places that come into play, places that are a little ugly for the moment and that will turn into something else. So that re-centralization of the city will happen through the emergence of new cities. And so with these new infrastructure elements, both productive and public, we're thereby organizing a new system. And as Helen said, the city will now have that certain quality standard. Ron, let me now turn to you. Earlier on, we said that in the U.S., public spaces are designed differently than in Europe. So what would be your take on that difference? What's a public space in the U.S.? What's considered as a public space in the U.S., if that actually exists? You know, because between Texas and New York, I would imagine that those views would be quite different, yes? And I can answer that one for Europe, after all,
it's the battle
as well.
of the continents. I would not say that public space doesn't exist in the U.S. There are some clear examples. If you simply go to the 19th century and look at what was happening with cities at the end of the 19th century into the 20th, there are lots of efforts to invent something at least a bit like a European public space. And so whether it's gardens or parks, you see those all over the U.S. The big fish in that one is Olmsted and what he did with cities in the Northeast and elsewhere in the U.S. So, but I think there is something interesting that happens, and it maybe, in fact, makes me quite hopeful about an American version of public space, not one that's competitive with the other versions, say. And that has to do with the nature of urban densification and the necessary relationship between public life and what has traditionally been seen as public space. This is a kind of a third rail, I think, in discourse around public space, but I think that there are potentials in the way that architecture, urbanism, and public life meet that have to do with their merger at the bottom of buildings. The reason the studio in Paris was called Urbanise is that's part of a long stretch of studios that I've been teaching that have to do with this relationship. As we densify, all of that dense space, private sector space, comes down and meets the city. This is public, this is private, and something happens where they meet, which is in the process of changing. That no longer is sustainable as a tidy differentiation of public and private life. The model that I think exists in the US actually maybe provokes that more assertively, more aggressively, as a site of experimentation. It's impossible to separate architecture and public life and urbanism at that location. So this is, for me, a quite interesting subject, and that's where I see a kind of future of public life. Not against the open space, not against the plaza, not against the park, but one in which the vibrancy of social, economic intensification that comes with density, every side of density being a good thing in my view, is quite exciting to think about as producing a new kind of public life. It tends to reside still primarily on the ground plane, but it tends to go up into one floor up, maybe 2 floors up, and then it gets very tricky beyond that.
I believe you wanted to answer this question as well. As Europeans, we always tend to say, look, that's what a US city looks like, supposedly. And yes, in our European history, we had that approach. But today, European cities are perhaps turning more and more American. And here, I'm not only thinking of Catalonia. So perhaps there are a few takeaways that we can bear in mind when it comes to US cities. These US cities, if they find mechanisms to work around average density, then that might be interesting. Firenze, Paris, i.e. central Paris, i.e. central Barcelona, these are cities that are considered as beautiful. But if you go away from central Paris, for example, if you go away from central Barcelona and you go to the outskirts of Barcelona, you'll find yourselves in places that are quite similar to US cities. So apart from central cities, you want to have more dense areas that are more sustainable. You want to take into account the energy transition. You're both a local community, but you're part of something larger here. So that's why you really want to discuss all of these models in a very open manner to improve that model on the basis of what already exists.
Maybe try to reinforce the comparison that Joan introduced with San Francisco, with the Bay Area. And it maybe is a way of trying to bridge this a little bit. I think there's a very interesting, it was almost shockingly surprising to me to see that example in this context. because I think what's curious about the Bay Area, the BART system, is the center of that system is empty. It's water. And so if you will struggle a little bit, I think I would struggle a little bit to make the comparison directly with Paris. However, if you sort of force the comparison, and then you imagine that, in fact, what the new system is doing is making a kind of a donut around Paris, it is very similar. It just so happens that it has this kind of charming 3,000-year-old city in the middle of it, as opposed to a lot of water. And this is one of the strengths of the new system, is it will produce this ring of potential. What it looks like, very hard to predict. I don't think that's really the point. I think as it creeps out of the ground and sort of reveals itself, all of those sort of emergences that the stations produce will produce a kind of ring, not in opposition to the center, but a ring that one can find a kind of echo of in the BART system in San Francisco.
Sure. That probably it goes beyond with that. I think, Ron, I think you're right, that nobody can predict how this new system of circles will induce and how long it will take. I think that's very important. And then it's a lot of research that must be done also here about to imagine how these things could happen. Because in my eyes, that could be the only way that certain type of social housing policy can be put in place. Because the land is still quite affordable in a way, and other type of activities as well.
Moi, je voudrais appuyer justement sur cette question.
Yes, so to go back to the question of perhaps ideologies, and you were referring to certain ideologies that are backing certain grand projects. But when we inaugurated the Metro exhibition here, we didn't have any minister, any Secretary of State coming, and yet this is the largest European urban planning project, 36 billion euros. And so I felt that on the decision-making side with politicians, they weren't really in a capacity to tell these stories. So it seems that people are having a hard time understanding the very meaning of it. So just like if we were manufacturing a beautiful car, but with no idea what we're going to do with that. Some of that is very well and good, but we also know that when we had all of these architects who were a little reluctant with regards to the Grand Paris project, well, they said that perhaps we needed strong architecture to imprint that mental image of all of these spaces. So maybe that's what these stations are all about. With the artists who were involved, well, these stations will turn into benchmarks, references, so that we finally know where Stein is, just like we know where the Arc de Triomphe is. Well, I think it was a choice that was made for the project. You know, there are various scales to every project, and every scale should be quite autonomous and independent. When it comes to past railways, however, you had type A, B, or C railway stations, depending on the size of the city. But for that project, it was not the choice that was made, and I appreciate that. Of course, it adds a new layer of complexity because, you know, in terms of planning, etc., it makes things more complex, but it adds more value. 68 train stations, which will henceforth produce pretty much 40 landmarks. So the question that you referred to is really interesting. Politicians do not tend to give much value to that question at all. It's not important for them. You know, when the first railways were built in the 19th century, did they ever imagine all of the changes that would bring about? No. So we should be proud of the capacity of such projects to invent the future. But beware of mistakes. Let us not create any disaster. Let us be very cautious. But when it comes to urban projects, there's that capacity to prepare for the future, to pave the way for the future, with a certain know-how, with a certain experience, with a certain capacity, with skills. Urban projects, generally speaking, are highly complex enterprises, but they truly add value. And even in our school, we discuss a lot. We discuss a lot with local communities, but you really want to have a clear story that can be told to communities, because my idea is not coming from nowhere. You really want to explain things. And in many schools, there's still that idea that the architect is a bit of a visionary. You know, this is the vision that I had last night. No, that's something that pertains to the 19th century. Okay, so the architect in the 21st century, what kind of a vision do they have? Well, the architect today knows that they need to work at various scales. You want to work with operators, agencies, local communities, but you want to have also ideas that are well-founded and properly informed. So that's why you really need to know what's happening in Paris, what's happening in Chicago, and the whys and the hows. No copy-paste, yes, but you want to be properly informed and document yourself. Ron, you worked on a French project. Was it the first time that you did that with students, or had you worked on other European projects before?
European, yes. In France, no. Several projects in Berlin.
Berlin.
Yeah. Yeah. I wonder if I could jump in. I want to respond a little bit to your question.
Sure.
And to Joan. There are a couple of things. One is I agree with your assertion that in a way the metro project has a kind of public relations problem. We found that when we were working on the jury, selecting projects, we thought, okay, here's this project. It's not really done. What do we do with that? But when we arrived here, it was almost comic to hear the number of people who actually were unaware of the project. There are these giant machines crawling around underneath the city, and nobody seemed to know that they were there. And on the one hand, that was quite funny. And on the other, I think the way I take that now is actually, in a sense, the best is yet to come. In other words, as these machines pop out of the ground and move out, very interesting things happen. This is the best moment of I think, the project, because not only that it becomes visible, but it becomes a project with implications for the life in every one of these contexts, 68 contexts. The place where I might diverge a little bit is on the way in which these stations might play a role. There's a bit the kind of history of the little stations in Paris. They're iconic. They're important. Every architect learns about them in some history course. And I think this is quite different, actually, this moment. I don't think they're unimportant. I think they're very important, and it's remarkable to see the encyclopedia of architecture that's playing out in Paris right now as a result. But I think there are particular parts of architecture that become more important right now in all of those projects. For me, they are the ground, the parvis, and I mean that quite literally, what you walk on when you're making your way into a station, and the roof, which is what you walk under as you make your way into the station. Those two subsets of architecture become really, really exciting to me to think about. And not necessarily quite so much all the vertical surfaces. So there's something quite interesting. I don't think these are targets in the way that Haussmann in Paris is set up with kind of, you see a monument, you go there, you go to another monument, you go to another monument. I think, in fact, you slip into the city and you slip out of these stations into the city, and they are transitional in that sense. And that's their significance. It's a very different kind of architecture that rises to the surface, literally, in each of these stations in that sense. It's not the same game.
And also the fact that architects were associated with artists for each project. Is this something that's quite common in the US, or is this something that you found exceptional here?
It's also quite common in the U.S. There's a kind of 1% for art, you know, with every building project or any significant building project. I think that's an interesting question. I don't tend to look onto these actions as if I see something exciting, that's the end game. I tend to see the station as producing a set of relations. So a set of relations to program, a set of relations to movement, a set of relations to aesthetics, a set of relations to something called culture, maybe embodied in art. The role of that art as a kind of decoration that says, oh, I come to this and now I genuflect in front of it because it's important art, is less interesting to me. So maybe I'm speaking a bit more personally than I'm supposed to, but I find it much more interesting to think of the role of that art being something that I swing past, near, and then onward from into some other set of relations in the city. So I think this would be a very interesting subject to take up today because aesthetics matter, beauty matters, as has been pointed out already today. But I think it not in a kind of singular or self-sufficient way does that beauty matter.
J'avais posé au départ une question, je voudrais vous la reposer. Est-ce que quand
Joan, here's a question I wanted to ask you again. When you worked in Barcelona for the Olympic Games, that question of mobility and of flows and movement, was it already a key question? And the answer is yes. But the Grand Paris Express project is not at all related to the Olympic Games. But yes, mobility should always be the center of the equation. Right now, we are doing research on exceptional major projects, and we're discovering, I mean, when we started our research, and it will be presented in Paris next year or in 2 years, you know, at the start we were rather skeptical. But as we went on with our research, we discovered that throughout the world, architecture and engineering have invented so many things for major projects. So these major projects are a possibility to do things, to try to do things that would not be possible otherwise. For example, today, the travelator that you have in airports, you know, these travelators, well, they were invented in Paris as part of an expo in 1911. But it was a disaster back then, didn't work, and then at the next expo, it was very successful, and it worked perfectly well, and things went on their merry way from there. So it was a process. I think that there's an entire system. You know, it's quite incredible. I studied this. You know, the way that architects such as Corbusier have tried to intervene as part of these expos because they were opportunities to try new things, to show certain things. So the Olympic Games in Paris, you know, I'm not really sure, but I'd be very interested to see the way that Olympic Games are leading to new possibilities that will be here to stay. And, you know, the Grand Paris project is wonderful from a project standpoint in that sense. And in our research, one of the key outcomes was to show that there were 7 expos in Paris, 7 expos in London, and the results in the city, however, were completely different. In Paris, you have a huge tourist district that's the result of these expos, but in London, nothing is to be seen, because the expos moved, you know, from one dot to the next. It's really important to show these kinds of things. You want project capacities, but you also want to think of the result
hem de connaître et voir les résultats après.
I'd be very curious to see, what will be the possibilities that emerge from the Olympic Village. In Barcelona, the Olympic Village, well, it was the very first time that we created a neighborhood in Barcelona where 40% of the housing after the expo would be dedicated to social housing. It was the very first time, because in the past we would have had, these subsidized housing, but, on the outskirts, and it would be a standalone development, whereas here it was fully integrated into that neighborhood, 40%. Well, I think that in any case, when it comes to the positive or not so positive effects of such ideas, well, you have the question of, okay, so we're going to be opening up these communities, but at the same time we're gentrifying these disenfranchised areas, so that leads to a whole host of other issues. Anyway, time is running out. Ron Witte, you referred to the fact that we are now creating that donut around Paris, and in your presentation, I believe you wanted to refer to cheesecakes as well. And that reminds me of a quote by Jean-Marc Barnier, who said that in a successful operation, it's just like a cake. Everyone will bring their own ingredient. One will bring the flour, the milk, the butter, and the cherry on top of the cake. So hopefully that's exactly what will happen with the Grand Paris Express. So we're going to have to stop here, unfortunately, because we could have gone on and on and on with that discussion. Thank you so much to the both of you and to our audience. Thank you.